The morning Catherine Norris discovered the sapling on her land. She stood so still in the pale April light that the meadowlarks forgot she was there, and went right on singing. It was the spring of 1878, in the sun-scorched basin country of southeastern Colorado, where the wind came down off the Sangre de Cristo Mountains with a personality all its own, and where a woman alone on 160 acres of dry grass and stubborn clay had to fight for every inch of ground she claimed. Catherine had been fighting for 14 months. 14 months since her husband Thomas had gone cold in the night, with a fever that no amount of wet rags or whispered prayers could break. 14 months since she had buried him under the cottonwood at the creek bend, wrapped him in the good wool blanket she had carried all the way from Missouri, and told herself she was not going to cry again until the work was done. She was still waiting on the work to be done. She had pulled on her boots and walked the fence line at dawn the way she did every morning, checking the wire Thomas had strung before he died, making sure the posts had held through whatever the night had thrown at them. The northeast corner was always the first trouble spot. The soil there was loose and sandy, and the posts had a way of leaning like old men tired of standing. She had her hammer in her hand and her mind already on the third post from the oak stump when she saw it. A tree. Small, no taller than her knee, but unmistakably a tree, its roots pressed carefully into the earth, the soil tamped down around the base with someone's deliberate hands. A cottonwood, from the look of the narrow silver-green leaves, though it was young enough that she had to crouch down and look closely to be certain. Someone had dug a neat hole, set the sapling in, pressed the earth firm, and even carried water to it, because the ground around the roots was still faintly dark with moisture in a place where no rain had fallen for 10 days. Catherine stood back up slowly. She looked east, toward the road that ran a quarter-mile from her property line. She looked north, where the grassland rolled away toward the ridge where the Hendersons ran their cattle. She looked west, where the horizon was still flushed with the last orange colors of the early morning. There was nobody. There was only the wind and the meadowlarks and this impossible, presumptuous little tree sitting on her land as though it had every right to be there. Her first instinct was to pull it up. She was a woman who had a precise sense of order because order was the only thing keeping her ranch from collapse, and a stranger planting things on her land without her permission was not order. It was an intrusion. She curled her fingers around the slender trunk, feeling the smooth bark against her palm. The roots held. Whoever had planted it had done so with patience, working the roots down into the earth rather than just jabbing the thing in and hoping. She felt the resistance of something that had already decided to stay. She let go. She did not know why exactly. She told herself it was because she had fence posts to deal with and could not afford to spend any more time crouching in the northeast corner arguing with a tree. She told herself that the sapling was small and presented no immediate problem and could be removed later. She straightened up, tucked her hammer back into her belt, and walked on down the fence line. But she glanced back at it twice before she rounded the corner, and both times she felt something in her chest that she could not quite name and did not quite want to. Robert McCrae had been watching from behind the ridge. He was not a man who spied on people, and he told himself so firmly as he lay on his stomach in the dry grass with his hat pushed back from his forehead, and his gray eyes fixed on the woman crouching beside the sapling he had planted 2 nights ago in the dark. He had not planned to come back and watch. He had told himself planting the tree was enough, that what happened to it after was none of his business. But he had come back anyway, and now he watched Catherine Norris stand up, look at his tree for a long moment, and walk away without pulling it up. He exhaled slowly. Robert was 31 years old, tall and lean in the way that hard outdoor work makes a man lean, with wide shoulders and hands that were scarred and rope-burned and capable of tremendous gentleness when the situation called for it. He had been riding through the basin country for the better part of 2 years, working cattle drives, fixing fence for whoever needed it fixed, occasionally running horses down from the mountains for the Cimarron Ranch. He was not looking to put down roots, or that is what he told anyone who asked. The truth was more complicated. The truth was that he had put down roots once before, in Texas, and they had been ripped out of him so thoroughly that he had spent the better part of a decade being afraid of the act of rootedness itself. He had seen Catherine Norris for the first time in November, when the basin had been locked under a gray sky, and he had ridden into the small town of Delwood looking for a meal and a night out of the cold. She had been at the general store, loading sacks of cornmeal and dried beans into a wagon by herself, and the store owner, a fleshy man named Gerald Pratt, had been leaning on the doorframe watching her do it without offering any help. Robert had dismounted and crossed the street, and taken the heaviest sack from her hands before he quite realized he was doing it. She had looked at him with dark brown eyes that were assessing and not at all grateful in any simple way, and she had said, "I can manage it." He had said, "I know you can. I am doing it anyway." And she had studied him for a moment and then said, "Fine." Second sack from the left. They had loaded the wagon together in silence, and when it was done she had said, "Thank you," in a voice that was direct and unadorned and somehow more affecting than any elaborate gratitude would have been. Then she had climbed onto the wagon seat and driven away without looking back. He had asked about her at the saloon that evening. Had learned that she was the widow Norris, that she had come out from Missouri with her husband 3 years ago, that the husband had died of fever the previous winter, that she was running the ranch alone, that she had no family within 500 miles, and that there was an ongoing pressure on her from a man named Josiah Dalton, who owned the biggest spread in the county, and wanted the Norris 160 for the water rights on the creek. The man who told him all this was a quiet-spoken old cowhand named Silas Prout, who had known Thomas Norris slightly and thought Catherine was one of the stoutest-hearted women he had ever come across, which in his experience put her in exceedingly select company. Robert had ridden away from Delwood thinking he would not come back. He had ridden away from Delwood and come back 4 days later on a pretext of picking up supplies, and had passed the Norris Ranch Road and looked down it and ridden on. He had come back again in January and again in February, and each time he had found some reason to pass her road. In March he had stopped. He had sat his horse at the end of her road and watched the smoke rising from her chimney in the cold gray morning, and felt something so large and inconvenient inside his chest that he had actually put his fist against his sternum as though he could press it down. He was not good at talking to women. He was not, if he was honest, good at talking to anyone about anything that mattered. He could discuss cattle and weather and the state of the roads with perfect comfort. Everything below that level of conversation went quiet in him, the words stopping before they reached his mouth like water backing up behind a dam. He had loved a woman in Texas when he was 22. Her name had been Alice, and she had been sweet and bright and had died of cholera 6 weeks after their wedding, and the grief of it had taken something vocal out of him that had not fully grown back in the 9 years since. So he had not knocked on Catherine Norris's door. He had planted a tree instead. He had thought about it for a week before he did it, which for Robert McCrae counted as serious deliberation. He had found the cottonwood sapling on the bank of the creek 4 miles east, where a grove of them grew in a tangle of roots and silver leaves. He had dug it up in the evening with a small spade, wrapped the roots in wet burlap, ridden out to the northeast corner of the Norris property in the dark of 2 nights ago, and planted it in the soft sandy ground that he had noticed was the most troubled part of her fence line on the one occasion he had ridden along the property edge. A cottonwood there would hold the soil with its roots. It would provide shade in the summer. It would grow, if tended, into something lasting. He had not thought past the planting. He had not planned what it meant, or what he would do if she pulled it up or if she didn't. He had just done it because he was a man who showed care through action when words escaped him, and the need to show care had become so pressing that the darkness and the quiet and the soft sandy earth had seemed like the only available language. She had not pulled it up. He pushed himself back from the ridge and got to his feet, brushing the dry grass from his shirt front, and stood looking out at the basin in the growing morning light. He needed work. The Cimarron Ranch had given him a month's wages and turned him loose 2 weeks ago when the drive was finished, and he had been camping near the creek, making his money last, not quite able to bring himself to ride on to the next job the way he always had. He needed work, and the Norris Ranch needed labor. Any fool could see that from the road, and these two things could intersect in a way that was completely practical and had nothing to do with cottonwood saplings or dark brown eyes or the uncomfortable feelings currently occupying his chest. He went and found his horse, a big sorrel named Duff, and rode around to the front road. Catherine was mending harness on the porch when the rider came up her road. She watched him come with the careful attention she gave to everything that approached her property, one hand resting near the rifle she kept propped against the porch post. He was on a sorrel horse, riding easy, hat low against the morning glare, and as he came closer she recognized something about him. The set of the shoulders, the direct, unhurried way he rode. She had not thought about him since November, or rather she had not admitted to herself that she had thought about him since November, which was different. He pulled up at the bottom of the porch steps and touched his hat. "Ma'am, my name is Robert McCrae. We met briefly in November outside the general store. I remember," she said, "you took my cornmeal." Something shifted at the corners of his mouth. "I helped carry your cornmeal," he said. "There is a distinction." "There is," she agreed. She studied him. "What brings you out here, Mr. McCrae?" "I am looking for work," he said. "I am a fair hand at most things that need doing on a ranch. Fencing, horsework, building, whatever requires it. I would work for room and board and a wage if you can manage it, or room and board alone if you cannot. I have seen your place from the road, and I think you could use the help." She could. She absolutely could, and the acknowledgement of it was a small private humiliation, not because she was ashamed of needing help, but because she had spent 14 months telling herself and everyone else that she did not. She looked at him for a long moment. He looked back without flinching and without any particular expression of pleading or persuasion, just a steady, patient regard that she found unexpectedly settling. "There is a bunkhouse behind the barn," she said finally. "It has not been used in some time. The roof needs attention. You could start there." "Yes, ma'am," he said. "My terms are room and board and $4 a week," she said. "That is what I paid the last hand I had, and it is what I can afford. If you find it insufficient, we can part on good terms." "It is sufficient," he said. "I will need a reference," she said. "I will not take on a stranger without one." He reached into his shirt pocket and produced a folded piece of paper. "Silas Pruitt at the Cimarron Ranch can speak to my character. I have a letter from him here." She took it, unfolded it, read it. Silas Pruitt had written in a cramped, careful hand that Robert McCrae was the most reliably honest worker he had known in 30 years of ranching, that he was skilled with horses and cattle and tools, that he was quiet-natured and respectful, and that any employer would be fortunate to have him. She refolded the letter and handed it back. "You can start Monday," she said. "Today is Friday. Use the weekend to get the bunkhouse roof in order." "Thank you, Mrs. Norris," he said. "Catherine," she said, and was mildly surprised to hear herself say it. "If you are going to work here, you might as well use my name." He nodded. "Robert," he said, "if that suits." "It suits," she said. He unsaddled Duff at the hitching post, led him around to the barn, and got to work on the bunkhouse roof with a quiet competence that Catherine, watching from the kitchen window while she kneaded bread, found herself observing for longer stretches than was strictly necessary. The ranch was not large, but it was complex with neglect. There were 160 acres, roughly half in grass that could support cattle if she ever had enough of them, and half in the rougher ground near the creek where the soil went sandy and the scrub oak grew thick. Thomas had put up the main house, a solid 2-room structure with a good fireplace, and the barn, which was sound but dim. The bunkhouse had been built optimistically, as though Thomas had intended to eventually hire a full crew, but only one hand had ever lived in it, and that man, a young cowboy named Pete Dawes, had left the previous September when the wages ran out. Catherine had 11 cattle, a milk cow, 4 horses, 30-some chickens, and a kitchen garden that she had coaxed through 2 dry summers with sheer stubbornness. She had a note outstanding at the Delwood Bank, the inheritance of Thomas's land purchase, and she had been meeting the payments through selling beef when she could, selling eggs at the general store, and one terrible winter month, taking in mending for 3 of the ranch wives in the county at 10 cents a garment. She had her pride about very nearly everything, but about that particular month she had made her peace, because the alternative had been to lose the land. She did not tell Robert any of this directly, but she suspected he could read most of it from the state of things. Men who worked ranches long enough developed a literacy for what was thriving and what was struggling, just from the look of the fences and the condition of the animals and the manner in which a woman watched every penny when she talked about supplies. He was careful with her pride. She noticed that immediately. He did not mention what was in disrepair in a way that made her feel the weight of the disrepair. He simply fixed things, quietly and efficiently, in an order that suggested he had looked at the whole ranch and made a private assessment of priorities. The bunkhouse roof first, then the loose hinge on the barn's main door that had been making her nervous for months. Then the 3rd fence post in the northeast corner, which he sank a full foot deeper into the ground with a thoroughness that made the post look permanent for the first time since Thomas had put it in. She watched him work on that post from a distance. He was near the sapling. He did not mention the sapling. He did not look at it with any particular significance. He just fixed the post, tamped the earth, checked the wire tension, and moved on to the next post down the line. And yet she was quite certain, with a certainty she could not logically explain, that the sapling was his. It grew on her over the first 2 weeks, this certainty, the way the conviction of a thing can grow even without evidence, building in the quiet spaces between practical interactions. He was there at 6 in the morning and gone from sight by dark, working steadily through the long spring days. She fed him at the table, breakfast and supper, and they talked about the work, about which pasture should be rotated, about whether the sorrel Duff and her best mare Rosalie might produce a decent foal, about the state of the creek and whether it had run higher or lower than usual through the winter. Practical things, comfortable things. But there were other things, the things that accumulated in the silences. The way he always poured her coffee before his own without making anything of it. The way he had quietly begun stacking the firewood so the pieces she needed were at the front and not buried under the heavy chunks she could not easily lift. The way he had, without saying a word, begun fixing the kitchen garden fence after noticing that one side had been letting the chickens in to scratch at the seedlings. Small things. A continuous grammar of small things that meant something, though she was not yet ready to say what. The tree was growing. It was visibly, determinedly growing, putting on an inch or 2 of new growth in the warm spring weather, the leaves broadening and turning from silver green to a deeper, more decided green. She visited it on her morning fence walks and told herself she was checking the wire on that section and not the tree, but she always looked at it, always crouched to see how the roots were settling, always noted with a private satisfaction that it was rooting itself well in the sandy ground. In the 3rd week of May, Josiah Dalton came to call. Catherine had been expecting him. He had come twice since Thomas died, each time with his hat in his hand and a reasonable expression on his face, and an offer that got slightly better each time but was still, in her estimation, an insult. He wanted the creek water rights. He had 500 acres north and east of her, good grass country but dry country, and the Norris Creek was the nearest reliable water for miles. He had offered twice what Thomas had paid for the land, then 2.5 times. He was a man who believed that everything had a price, and that the only variable was finding the right number. He came in a buggy this time, with a man riding alongside, a broad-shouldered individual named Cal Reeves who served as Dalton's foreman and, in Catherine's private assessment, general instrument of intimidation. She came out on the porch when she heard the buggy, and Robert came around from behind the barn, having heard it too, and stood at the corner of the house with his thumbs hooked in his belt and an expression of complete neutrality. Dalton was a thick man in his 50s with a gray mustache and the careful grooming of someone who considered appearance to be a form of argument. He tipped his hat with full courtesy. "Mrs. Norris, you are looking well." "Mr. Dalton," she said. "I see you have hired on a hand," he said, glancing at Robert with a practiced estimation. "I have," she said. "Sensible," Dalton said, with the tone of a man who considers himself the arbitrator of what is sensible. "A woman running land alone ought to have help, though of course the alternative to hiring help is to let someone take the burden of the land off her hands entirely." He smiled. "I have come with an improved offer, Mrs. Norris, 3 times the original purchase price. For the full 160, water rights included, you would have enough to see you comfortably settled elsewhere, perhaps back east with family." "I have no family east," she said. "And I am not interested in relocating, comfortably or otherwise. This is my land, Mr. Dalton." "It is," he agreed pleasantly. "At present." The 2 words sat in the air between them with a weight that he had put there deliberately, and Catherine felt the small, cold crawl of it, but she kept her voice level. "I will not be selling. I have told you that on 2 previous occasions, and I am telling you again. I would appreciate it if you would take that as a final answer." Dalton studied her for a moment. Then he looked at Robert again, a longer look this time, the kind of look that was meant to communicate that he was taking note of things. "I see," he said. "Well, the offer stands, Mrs. Norris. I am patient." He settled his hat back on his head. "Good day." The buggy turned and went back down the road. Catherine watched it go without moving until it was out of sight, and then she let out a slow breath and turned back to the house. "That man," Robert said quietly from the corner, "is going to be a problem." "He has been a problem for over a year," she said. "I have managed him." "I know you have," he said. "I am saying he is going to try harder." She looked at him. His voice had not been alarmed or overreaching. It had been level and informational, and she thought he was probably right. "Yes," she said, "he probably will." She went back inside, and Robert went back to whatever he had been doing behind the barn, and neither of them said anything further about it that day. But that night, sitting at the supper table, she was more aware than she had been before of how alone the ranch was, and how much she appreciated, though she did not say so, the fact that there was a light in the bunkhouse window. Silas Prout came out from Delwood on a Saturday afternoon in early June, nominally to check on a horse he had sold to the Hendersons, whose property lay adjacent to Catherine's east fence, but really, as everyone understood, to see how Robert was getting along. He was a weathered old man with kind eyes and a slow, comfortable way of talking, and he took coffee on the porch and addressed himself principally to Catherine with a frankness that she found endearing. "Robert is a good man," Silas said, when Robert was out of earshot tending to the horses. "I expect you have figured that out by now." "He is a very competent worker," Catherine said carefully. "He is that," Silas agreed. "But I am not talking about competent. I have known a lot of competent men. Competent does not make a man good. Robert is one of the honest-to-God good ones. He had a hard time of it when he was young, and some men come out of hard times harder and some come out softer, and he came out both, which is the rarest and best combination." He sipped his coffee. "Just thought you ought to know." "Why are you telling me this?" Catherine said. Silas looked out at the yard where Robert was moving between the barn and the paddock. "Because he would not tell you himself," he said simply. "Not ever. That is also something you ought to know." He left an hour later, and Catherine thought about what he had said for the rest of the evening, turning it over the way you turn over a stone to see what is underneath, not quite ready to look directly at it. The cottonwood sapling was now 1.5 feet tall. She measured it one morning without entirely meaning to, just an idle gesture, marking the height against the fence post with her thumb, and then she held her thumb there and counted the inches and felt a smile she had not planned. 1.5 feet. It was growing. Whatever soil the root system had found in that sandy ground, it had found enough. The roots had taken. She was coming back from the fence line when she found Robert at the well, shirtless in the June heat, drawing water over his head. She stopped, because stopping was the honest thing, and he turned at the sound of her boots on the ground and reached for his shirt with neither haste nor performance, just a natural, unhurried motion. But for a moment she had seen the width of his back and the long scar along his left shoulder that she had not known about before, and she found that her breath had done something quiet and complicated. "Hot today," she said, which was not what she had intended to say. "Yes," he agreed, buttoning his shirt. He had the good grace not to look at her quite directly for the first moment. "I was going to ask," she said, recovering her composure and her original intention, "whether you have experience with cattle doctoring. I think the brindle cow has a bad tooth, and I have been dealing with it myself, but it needs someone who can hold her steady while I work on it." "I can hold her steady," he said. They worked on the cow together for the better part of an hour, a task that required close quarters and complete mutual trust in each other's movements. And at several points, they were near enough that she could feel the warmth of him and smell the honest smell of outdoor work and horse, and something else she could not name that was just him. He was steady and sure with the cow, talking to her in a low voice that she responded to remarkably well, and when the tooth was out and the cow was settled and they were standing side by side washing their hands at the trough, Catherine said, "You are good with animals." "They don't require as much explaining as people," he said. She laughed. She had not laughed like that quickly and that genuinely, in longer than she could remember, and the sound of it surprised her as much as it seemed to surprise him, and for a moment they were both very aware of the laugh and what it meant, which was that she was comfortable with him, which was a thing she had not been fully willing to admit before. He looked at her then, the direct, unhurried look that she was beginning to recognize, and something in the look was warm and careful and very honest. She looked back for a moment longer than she should have, and then she picked up her pail and said she needed to check the bread and went to the house with her heart doing something undignified in her chest. She was 30 years old. She had been born in a farmhouse in Missouri in 1848, had grown up in the practical, unsentimental school of frontier living, had married Thomas Norris when she was 24 because he was a good man with good intentions, and she had loved him, quietly and sincerely, in the way that two people who understand each other can love without drama. When Thomas died, she had grieved in the specific and thorough way that she did everything, and she had put the grief where it needed to go, not away, because she was not a woman who buried things dishonestly, but into its proper place, the place where you keep what is past and precious and no longer present. She had not expected to feel anything new. She had not, if she was being truthful with herself, thought she had the appetite for it. She set the bread pail down on the counter and stood at the kitchen window, looking out at the yard where Robert had gone back to work on the fence of the east paddock, his movements methodical and easy and sure. She thought about the cottonwood sapling in the northeast corner and the particular quality of care that had gone into the planting of it, and she thought about what Silas had said, that Robert would not tell her himself, not ever. She thought about the way he had said her name that first morning, Catherine, with the same weight he gave to the practical things, fence posts and water rights, as though her name was a practical thing he intended to take seriously. She thought, "I have not pulled the tree up." She thought, "He knows I have not pulled it up." She thought, "This is a conversation we are having without saying a single word, and I wonder how long it will go on before one of us is brave enough to use actual words." She went back outside and told him supper would be at 6, and he touched his hat and said he would be there, and it was the most ordinary exchange in the world, and it was not ordinary at all. In the first week of July, the trouble with Dalton escalated. It began with the water. Catherine woke one morning to find that the creek was running lower than it had any natural right to run in early July, and when she rode upstream to investigate, she found a makeshift earthen dam thrown up across the channel on the stretch of land where the creek crossed the corner of the Dalton property before entering hers. It was not a sophisticated dam, just a piled-up wall of dirt and rock and wood, but it was enough to reduce her flow by 2/3. And in July, 2/3 of the creek was the difference between the cattle managing and the cattle not. She was standing in the creek bed in her boots, looking at the dam with a fury she was working to keep controlled, when Robert arrived behind her on Duff. "He dammed the creek," she said. "I see that," he said. "This is my water. The creek enters my land from the north. The deed specifies water rights along the full channel where it crosses Norris property. I know. He cannot legally do this." "He cannot," Robert agreed. "The question is what you intend to do about it before the water does real damage to your stock." She turned to look at him. His face was quiet and attentive, not telling her what to do, just asking what she had decided. She had always appreciated that in a person, the understanding that a problem presented is better than a solution imposed. "I'm going to ride to Delwood and speak to the county sheriff," she said. "And I'm going to write a letter to the water rights office in Pueblo. And I'm going to come back here and remove this dam today, because it is an illegal obstruction of my deeded water rights, and I will not wait for the law's convenience while my cattle suffer." "I will help you remove it," he said. "I know you will," she said. And for a brief, fierce moment they looked at each other with the specific solidarity of people who are in something together. Then she turned and started pulling rocks from the dam, and he swung down from Duff and waded in beside her. It took 3 hours. The dam was heavier than it looked, and the creek mud was cold and thick and uncooperative. They worked without talking much, occasionally coordinating on a particularly large stone, their hands sometimes close and once, briefly, overlapping on a piece of timber, and neither of them commented on the overlap, but it was there. When the dam was broken and the water was running free and strong again, they stood in the creek with their boots soaked and their arms muddy to the elbows, and Robert said, "He will try again." "Probably," she said. "He wants you to be afraid," he said. "I know," she said. "I'm not going to give him that." Robert looked at her for a moment, and what was in his face was not pity and not admiration in any condescending sense, but something closer to recognition, the look of one person who understands persistence recognizing it in another. "No," he said, "I did not think you were." She rode to Delwood the following morning and spoke to Sheriff Aldous Crane, who was a fair-minded man of 50 with no particular liking for Josiah Dalton, and enough respect for the law that he rode out to inspect the dam site and took a formal report. He told her that Dalton's interference with her deeded water rights was illegal, and that if it happened again, he would have grounds for a charge. He could not reverse what had already happened, but he could make it costly to repeat. She also sent the letter to Pueblo, because she believed in covering her ground from multiple directions. She came home in the late afternoon to find that Robert had repaired the loose board on the north side of the barn, and had set a new post on the western fence line, and had put supper on. Not an elaborate supper, just beans and bacon and cornbread, but it was hot and it was on the table, and when she sat down across from him she felt the unusual warmth of having someone take practical care of her, and found to her mild surprise that she did not mind it at all. "The sheriff will speak to Dalton," she said. "Good," he said. "It will not end there," she said. "No," he agreed. "But it will slow him down, and slowing him down gives you time." "Time for what?" He looked at her across the table. "Time for the ranch to get stronger," he said. "The more solid the place is, the harder it is to threaten. Right now you have 11 cattle. By fall you could have 15, 16 if the breeding goes well. In 2 years, 25. That is a different kind of position to be in." She watched him. "You are speaking as though you plan to be here in 2 years, she said. He went still. Not uncomfortable still, but the particular stillness of a person who has said something they meant more than they realized and is now accounting for it. He looked at her steadily. "I would like to be," he said, "if that is agreeable." The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the evening was turning the sky that deep turquoise that the Colorado summer evenings did, the color of old glass, and the first stars were coming out. Catherine looked at Robert McCrae across her kitchen table and thought about the cottonwood sapling that was now, in the warm July weather, approaching 2 feet in height, and putting on new leaves with the confidence of something that has made up its mind to stay. "It is agreeable," she said. They looked at each other for a moment that stretched and settled, and then she picked up her coffee cup and he picked up his fork, and the conversation moved back to the practical, as it always did. But the practical was different now, colored by the moment that had just passed, warmer and more specific in the way that things become when they are acknowledged rather than circled. The summer deepened. The days were long and hard and full of work, and Robert and Catherine fell into the rhythms of the ranch in a way that began to feel less like employer and employee, and more like two people building something together, which was, Catherine slowly allowed herself to understand, exactly what it was. He had a quiet humor that surfaced unexpectedly, dry and precise, that made her laugh in the same sudden, genuine way as the first time. She had a directness that he seemed to find not off-putting but restful, as though he had spent enough time navigating people's circumlocutions, that someone who simply said what they meant was a relief. One evening in late July they sat on the porch after supper because the house was still warm from the heat of the day and the porch caught the evening breeze off the mountains. She brought out coffee and he was leaning against the post, looking at the stars, and she sat on the steps and they were quiet together in the good way, the way where the silence is not absence but presence. "Tell me about Texas," she said. She had not planned to ask it. But Silas had said that Robert had a hard time when he was young, and she found she wanted to know, not out of curiosity but out of the specific desire to understand a person that comes with caring about them. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I married young. I was 22. Her name was Alice. She died of cholera 6 weeks after the wedding." She turned to look at him. He was still looking at the stars, his profile clean and still in the dark. "I am sorry," she said, and meant it in the fullest way, not the social way. "It was a long time ago," he said. 9 years, long enough that the grief is not what it was, but it changed me." A pause. "It made me afraid of staying places. Or maybe it made me think I was afraid, and I just went along with it because it was easier than finding out whether I was or not. And now," she said. He looked at her then, the direct, quiet look. "Now I am finding out," he said. She held his gaze for a long moment, and the warmth of the evening and the stars and the quiet ranch around them felt suddenly very precious, the way that moments feel when you recognize them as ones you will remember. She looked down at her coffee cup. "I was not afraid of staying," she said. "I was afraid of falling again. It seems to me like a luxury I could not afford." "A luxury," he repeated softly. "To love someone and then lose them," she said. "The losing is the expensive part." He considered this with the seriousness it deserved. "I think the not having is the more expensive part," he said finally. "In the long run." She thought about that. She thought about 14 months of winter evenings alone in a house that was built for two, and about the specific weight of that particular solitude. She thought about the cottonwood sapling and the care that had gone into the planting of it and what that care had communicated more clearly than any word could have. "Yes," she said, "I think you may be right." They did not say anything more that evening, but when she went inside, she stood at the kitchen window and watched the light in the bunkhouse for a long time before she went to bed, and she was smiling when she did. August brought a string of days so hot that the ground cracked and the cattle pressed into the shade of the creek willows, and even the chickens looked reproachful. Robert strung a second water trough near the barn, and repositioned the paddock shade cloth, and made arrangements for Rosalie and Duff, and the other horses to have access to the creek, without going through the fields, which saved the grass considerably. Catherine watched all these adjustments with a warm appreciation that she increasingly did not bother to conceal. She brought him cold water in the afternoons. It was a small thing, practical and easily explained, and she knew it was not actually small and she was not actually explaining it. He always accepted the water with thanks, and once, taking the jar from her hands, his fingers covered hers briefly, and she felt the warmth of it in a way that was entirely disproportionate to the temperature of the interaction. Their hands separated, and they both looked at the jar of cold water as though it required close examination. And then she went back to the house, and he went back to whatever he was building, and neither of them said anything, but the afternoon felt lit up around the edges. Josiah Dalton made his next move in mid-August. It was not the creek this time. It was the road. Specifically, he claimed that the road running through the northeast corner of his property, which Catherine had always used as her primary access to Delwood, crossed his land without formal easement, and he had a solicitor from Pueblo produce a document to that effect, and had new fence posts put in on either side of the road with a chain across it and a lock on the chain. Catherine found the chain on a Tuesday morning when she was on her way to town for supplies. She sat her horse in front of the chain for a full minute, breathing steadily, not allowing herself to react in any way that would give Dalton satisfaction. Then she turned her horse and rode back to the ranch. Robert was in the barn when she returned. He looked at her face and said, "What happened?" She told him about the chain. He listened without interrupting. When she was finished, he said, "There are two other roads to Delwood, the south road through Henderson's land, which he will allow if you ask him, and the creek road, which is longer but entirely on your own property for most of it." "I know," she said. "This is about making things harder, wearing me down." "Yes," he said. "I am not worn down," she said. "I can see that," he said. He paused. "There is also the question of whether his chain is legal. A road that has been in continuous use for years can establish a common law easement even without a formal document. Thomas Norris and whoever was on this land before him have been using that road. That has value in law." She looked at him. "How do you know about easements?" "I spent a winter in a law office in Abilene," he said. "It did not suit me, but I learned things." Despite herself, she laughed. And he smiled. And for a moment the problem of the chain and Josiah Dalton was still present, but was not the most important thing in the room. She wrote to a lawyer in Pueblo, a man named Edward Ferris, who had been recommended by Sheriff Crane as both competent and honest. She described the road situation in detail and requested advice on the question of common law easement. Ferris wrote back within the week, confirming that under Colorado territorial law, continuous and open use of a road for 7 or more years could establish an easement by prescription, and that Thomas Norris's records of land use going back to the original purchase in 1875 would be relevant evidence. He offered to take the case at modest rates given the circumstances. Catherine wrote back accepting his offer. She used the Henderson Road in the meantime, which William Henderson granted without hesitation, being a decent man who had no love for Dalton's methods. And she went on with the work of the ranch. Through all of it, Robert was simply there, not in a way that crowded her or suggested she needed managing, but in the way of a person who has decided that this place and this person are worth his best sustained effort and is quietly giving it. He had added, without being asked, a second layer of insulation to the north wall of the main house, which would matter enormously when winter came. He had found where the kitchen roof leaked, a tiny fissure invisible from inside, and had sealed it. He had cleared the creek bank of the deadfall timber that had been slowly accumulating and presenting a flood risk. He did all of it with the same steady, unceremonious competence, and Catherine felt the cumulative weight of all these acts of care the way you feel a growing warmth, gradually, and then all at once. On a Sunday in September, which she had established as the day of no work beyond necessary animal care, she packed a meal in a cloth and told him she was going to ride up to the ridge and would he like to come. He said he would. They rode up through the scrub oak and the waving dry grass to the ridge where the view opened up across the whole basin, the mountains blue and sharp in the clear September air, the grasslands rolling out in every direction, golden and immense. They tied the horses and sat on a flat-topped rock and ate cold chicken and cornbread and dried apples, and talked for 3 hours without any particular direction or purpose, the way that people who like each other talk when there is nowhere they have to be. He told her about the cattle drives he had been on, through Kansas and up from Texas. The long weeks on the trail with nothing but the same sky and the same cattle and the same group of men. And how it had suited him at one time, and had stopped suiting him without him quite noticing when. She told him about Missouri and her family there, a father who had farmed all his life and a mother who had read everything she could get her hands on and had passed this habit to her daughter, and two brothers who had stayed on the family farm while she and Thomas had come west looking for something bigger. She had not spoken about Missouri in a long time. The speaking of it felt good, like opening a window in a room that has been shut up. "Do you miss it?" he asked. "Missouri," she considered. "I miss my mother. I miss the particular green of the river country, but I do not miss it enough to go back to it." She looked out at the basin, at the hard, beautiful, enormous country that had taken everything from her and given her back something she could not yet fully name. "This is where I am," she said. "This is where I intend to stay." He was looking at her, not at the view, and she felt the look with the awareness she had been carrying all summer. "I know the feeling," he said quietly. She turned to look at him. He was close enough on the rock that she could see the fine lines at the corners of his eyes from years of squinting into sun and wind, and the gray that was coming in at his temples, and the particular careful quality of his expression, which was doing everything except saying directly what it meant. She was going to have to be the one to say it. She had known for some weeks that it would come to that. He was a man who would wait indefinitely rather than press. "Robert," she said. "Yes," he said. His voice was careful, as if he understood that something was about to happen. "The tree in the northeast corner," she said. "You planted it." He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "Yes." "You planted it on my land in the middle of the night without asking." "Yes," he said again. He held her gaze with a steady honesty. "And I did not pull it up," she said. A long pause. The wind came over the ridge and lifted a strand of her hair and settled it again, and somewhere below a hawk called. "No," he said softly. "You did not." "I need you to understand that I understood what that meant," she said. "What the tree meant when you planted it and what my leaving it meant when I found it." He was very still. "What did it mean?" he asked, and she could hear in the question that he knew the answer and needed to hear her say it. "It meant you were asking if I had room for something to grow," she said. "And it meant that I did." She held his gaze. "It means I do." He reached out then, slowly, the way he did everything, and took her hand where it rested on the rock between them. His hand was large and warm and roughened from work, and it enclosed hers with a careful, deliberate tenderness. He looked at her with the open, honest look she had never quite seen on anyone's face before, all the steadiness and the patience and the held-back feeling coming forward at once. "Catherine," he said, just that, just her name, and she understood everything in it. She leaned toward him slightly, and he met her, and the kiss was quiet and serious and true, the way they both were, nothing dramatic or performed about it, just two people acknowledging what had been true for a long time and was now being said in the most fundamental way. The mountains were there and the golden grassland and the wide sky, and her hand was in his, and she thought, "Yes, this is the thing I did not know I still had room for. And now that it is here, I cannot imagine what I was afraid of." They rode back down the ridge in the long, golden afternoon light, their horses close together on the trail. And when they arrived back at the ranch, Robert tended to the horses and Catherine made supper, and then they sat on the porch in the evening as they had all summer. But it was different now. The way everything is different when it has been said. He sat beside her on the steps instead of against the post, their shoulders close, and she rested her head against him for a little while and looked at the stars coming out over the mountains. "I have been afraid to trust something good," he said quietly into the dark. "I know," she said. "I am less afraid now." "I am glad," she said. "Because I intend to be a great deal of trouble. I have been told I am extremely stubborn." He laughed, low and warm, and the sound of it settled around her like something she had been waiting for without knowing it. "I have noticed," he said. "I find it one of your finest qualities." "You are the first person who has ever said that," she said. "Then the previous people were not paying attention," he said. October came, and with it the cottonwood sapling's first autumn. Its leaves went yellow in the crisper air. a true yellow, the color of butter, and they caught the light in the mornings like small lanterns. Catherine checked it on her fence walks and found it standing firm, rooted deeply enough now that it barely moved in the wind that came hard off the mountains in October, just a steady, assured trembling of yellow leaves. The sandy soil that had been the problem of that corner had become, through the roots, something more held together. The tree was doing what it had been put there to do. The legal matter of the road resolved in November. Edward Ferris's careful documentation of the Norris land's continuous road use, going back through Thomas's records and the testimony of William Henderson and Silas Prout, and even, unexpectedly, Gerald Pratt at the general store, who had known the road since before Thomas arrived, established the easement clearly under territorial law. Josiah Dalton was required by order of the county judge to remove the chain and recognize the road easement as legally established. He did so without grace, but without further resistance, and the judge's order also included a formal warning regarding the water interference of the previous summer. Catherine received the news from Ferris by letter and read it standing at the kitchen table with Robert across from her, and when she looked up her eyes were bright. "It is done," she said. "It is done," he agreed, and the quietness of his satisfaction matched hers entirely. "He will not come back from this," she said. "He is a man who cuts his losses. The legal record is against him now and he knows it." "He will try something else eventually," Robert said. "He is that kind of man. But you will be stronger and he will be a year older and more careful about which battles he picks." She set the letter down and looked at him. "Thank you," she said. "For what?" he said. "For being here through it," she said. "For the fence posts and the water dam and all the rest of it, for staying." He held her gaze. "There is no place else I would rather be," he said simply. She crossed the kitchen to him with the directness that was her nature, and kissed him in the full light of the November morning, and he held her with his big, careful hands and kissed her back with the accumulated feeling of a man who has been patient for a very long time, and is now being told that the patience was worth every moment. He proposed on a Saturday morning in December, when the first snow had come overnight, and the world was white and sharp and still. He did it in the kitchen over coffee, which was so completely like him that she did not mind at all that there was nothing ceremonial about it. He set his coffee cup down and looked at her and said, "Catherine, I would like to marry you. I know that is a plain way to say it, but I want you to know it as plainly as I can say it. I love you, and I want to build a life here with you, and I am asking you to let me." She looked at him across the kitchen that had become theirs, the ranch that had become theirs in every practical sense already, the life that was already thoroughly intertwined. She said, "Yes, Robert, that is what I want too." He smiled then, the full smile that she did not see often enough and treasured when she did, that made the lines at his eyes deepen and his whole face come alive. He reached across the table and took her hand. Outside the kitchen window, the snow was bright and the morning was clear, and somewhere in the northeast corner, under its covering of snow, the cottonwood tree was sleeping through its first winter, its roots settled deep in the earth of Catherine Norris's land. They were married in February of 1879, on a clear cold day at the small church in Delwood. It was a modest ceremony, because neither of them had any taste for ostentation, attended by Silas Prout and his wife, William and Martha Henderson, Sheriff Crane and his wife, Edward Ferris, who had made the journey from Pueblo, and a small contingent of townspeople who had watched Catherine Norris hold her land through 14 months of difficulty and had opinions, all of them favorable, about the kind of man she had chosen to share it with. Catherine wore a dress she had made herself from gray wool and ivory lace, practical and beautiful in equal measure, and she carried a small bunch of dried wild flowers because the February ground offered nothing else. Robert wore his best shirt and a dark coat that Silas had lent him, and he stood at the front of the church looking at Catherine coming down the aisle with an expression of such undisguised wonder and love that Martha Henderson, who prided herself on her composure, cried into her handkerchief, and said afterward that she had never seen a man look at a woman like that, not in 40 years of attending weddings. Catherine looked at Robert standing at the front of that small church and felt the particular quality of certainty that comes when you have chosen something not out of need or fear or loneliness, but out of real and willing love. She had made that distinction in her own mind many times in the months since September, asking herself clearly and without sentiment whether this was what she truly wanted or whether it was simply the comfort of not being alone. Each time the answer had come back clear. It was Robert. Specifically Robert, with his quiet care and his honest nature and his dry humor, and the way he held her hand, and the way he talked about the land as though its future were something he could see plainly and intended to build toward. The minister said the words and they said their words back, and when it was done and Robert kissed her in front of the small assembled company, someone, she thought it was Silas, said, "About time," and there was laughter and it was the best kind, warm and entirely meant. They held the celebration at the Henderson Ranch, which was larger and better suited for company, and there was a fiddle player and a harmonica and dancing on the swept barn floor. Catherine danced with Robert 3 times and found that he danced with a care and a light certainty that matched everything else about him, and she told him so, and he said he had learned in Texas, and they both understood that the mention of Texas was no longer the weight it had once been. They went home to the Norris Ranch that evening, now the McCrae Ranch in its name as well as its reality, and the bunkhouse was dark because Robert had moved his things into the main house in the week before the wedding, quietly and without making any ceremony of it, just shifting his few possessions from one building to another with the efficiency of a man who does not own more than he needs. She stood in the yard for a moment before going inside, breathing the cold February air, looking at the dark shape of the cottonwood in the northeast corner, barely visible in the dark, a thin column against the pale sky. She thought of the April morning almost a year ago when she had found it there, and stood with her hand on the bark and felt something she could not name and did not pull it up. "Come inside," Robert said behind her, his voice warm in the cold dark, his hand coming to rest on her shoulder. She turned and went inside with him, into the light and warmth of their house, and the door closed behind them. The spring of 1879 was good to them. The breeding had gone better than Robert's most optimistic calculation, and they added 5 healthy calves to the herd, bringing the cattle count to 16. A Hereford bull offered on good terms by William Henderson, who was quietly invested in the success of the McCrae Ranch in the way that good neighbors are invested in each other's prosperity, proved his worth immediately, and by summer it was clear that the herd would grow substantially. Robert had laid out a plan, careful and practical, for increasing the herd to 30 over 3 years, rotating the pastures to allow the grass to recover, digging a second water catchment in the southeast corner to supplement the creek in dry summers. Catherine ran the household accounts and the egg and butter business with the same precise attention she brought to everything, and by May she had paid off 1/3 of the remaining bank note, which was ahead of schedule, which pleased her enormously. She wrote to her brother Samuel in Missouri to tell him she was married and that the ranch was doing well, and Samuel wrote back with genuine happiness, and the news that their mother, who had been ill through the winter, was recovering, which was the best news she had received in a long time. The cottonwood tree in the northeast corner grew through the spring and summer of 1879 into a shape that was unmistakably a tree rather than a sapling, its trunk thickening, its canopy broadening into the wide, open spread that cottonwoods achieve with room to grow. By June it was casting real shade on the fence corner, and the sandy soil around its roots was firmer and better held than it had been in the 2 years of fence trouble that preceded it. Catherine measured it once, from the ground to the lowest branch, and it was over her head. She touched the bark and thought of the April morning and the April person she had been, 14 months widowed and holding herself together by stubbornness alone, And then she thought of the morning in September on the ridge and Robert saying her name the way he said it, with the weight of something real, and she felt the distance between those two people with gratitude. She was pregnant by September. She had suspected it in August and was certain by September, and she told Robert on an evening when they were sitting on the porch watching the long sunset over the mountains. She said, "I have something to tell you," and he set down his coffee and looked at her with his whole attention as he always did. When she told him, his face went through several things in quick succession: surprise and wonder, and a joy so broad it seemed almost to alarm him, as if it were too large for him to contain. He reached for her hands and held them and looked at her for a long time without saying anything, and then he said, "Catherine," in the way he had said it on the ridge, just her name, just the weight of everything. "Are you glad?" she said, though she could plainly see that he was. "I have never been more glad of anything in my life," he said. She laughed, which was becoming her most common response to his absolute honesty, and he laughed too, and the evening settled around them in all its warm September color. The winter of 1879 was cold but manageable. The new insulation Robert had added to the north wall of the house proved its value immediately, and they sat warm through the January storms while the cattle, who had good shelter in the improved barn, weathered the weather with minimal drama. Catherine was confined to lighter work as the pregnancy advanced, a confinement that she accepted with more grace than Robert had perhaps expected, though he was wise enough not to express surprise at this. She read in the evenings, the books she had accumulated from the Delwood General Store's modest supply, and from a box her mother had sent from Missouri that had arrived battered but intact, and Robert sat across from her and did his accounts or mended tack or simply read alongside her, a comfortable domestic tableau that neither of them could have fully imagined a year and a half ago. He worried about her, in the way that people who love carefully and deeply worry, not in a way that pressed or crowded, but in a way that manifested as attentiveness. He noticed when she was tired and said nothing, but arranged for the lighter tasks to be done before she had to do them. He had written to Delwood and engaged the services of Martha Henderson and a midwife named Ruth Calloway who served the Basin country, both of whom Catherine approved of. He had read, with typical thoroughness, the one medical text available at the Delwood doctor's office that addressed the subject, and what he could not do with knowledge he compensated for with presence. Their son was born on the 14th of March, 1880, in the main bedroom of the McCrae Ranch house, with Ruth Calloway presiding and Martha Henderson providing moral support and Robert pacing the kitchen, with a control that was admirable given the circumstances. The boy came into the world in the early morning, before dawn, loudly and with evident opinion about the proceedings, and when Ruth Calloway brought him out to the kitchen and put him in Robert's arms, Robert looked down at his son with an expression that Martha Henderson would describe to her husband that evening as the look of a man who has just understood something enormous, and she was right. He stood there with this small, fierce new person in his arms, and felt the roots of something go down into the earth of him, deep and certain, the way the cottonwood's roots had gone into the sandy corner of Catherine's land, changing the nature of the soil by being there. They named him Thomas William McCrae, Thomas for the man who had first worked this land and deserved to be remembered in it, and William for William Henderson, who had been a steady and decent neighbor through all of it. Tom, from the first week, though the full name was on the record. Catherine recovered with the same determined efficiency she brought to everything, and by April she was back at the lighter outdoor work, walking the fence line in the mornings with Tom in a cloth carrier Robert had made after examining and then improving upon an Arapaho design he had seen on a woman in Delwood. Tom slept through most of these walks, his dark head heavy and warm against Catherine's chest, and she would stop at the northeast corner and look at the cottonwood tree that was now, in its third spring, a genuinely impressive young tree, the trunk solid and the branches reaching wide, and she would stand there with her son against her chest and feel the depth of the particular life she had made. Silas Prout came for dinner in May and held Tom, and declared him the finest-looking boy he had seen since his own children were small, and Robert teased him about the low bar being set, and Silas laughed and said he stood by the assessment. Over dinner, Silas mentioned that Josiah Dalton had moved his primary operation north of the county line, buying a larger spread in the next territory, and had sold off the local holdings to a new buyer who had, by all accounts, no particular interest in the Norris Creek water and every interest in running a straightforward cattle operation. "I think," Silas said, looking at his coffee, "that you may have seen the last of that particular trouble." Catherine and Robert looked at each other across the table, Tom asleep in his cradle in the corner, the spring evening bright through the kitchen windows. "I think so too," Catherine said. The summer of 1880 was their first full summer as a family, and it was, in the way that the hard-earned things are, very good. The herd was growing as planned. The east pasture had recovered from 2 seasons of rest and was putting on grass that the cattle moved through with visible satisfaction. The cottonwood tree in the northeast corner had attracted a pair of yellow warblers who built a small, perfect nest in the fork of the lower branches, and Catherine discovered the nest one morning in late May and stood watching the female bring material for the better part of 10 minutes, lost in the specific pleasure of observing something small and miraculous. Tom at 4 months was a person of decided opinions. He liked the outdoors, disliked being put down when he was awake, and regarded his father with an expression of very serious appraisal that Robert found both amusing and slightly unnerving. He grew fast and determinedly, the way that children do when the soil of them is good, and he began to be interested in the horses by the time he could sit up on his own, reaching his small hands toward them with a concentrated attention that his parents recognized in each other and in themselves. Robert took him to the paddock for the first time when Tom was 6 months old, holding him securely while Rosalie, who was the most gentle of their horses, came forward to investigate and allowed herself to be touched by small reaching fingers. Tom stared at the horse with an intensity that was absolutely silent, which was remarkable from him. Catherine watched from the paddock fence and felt a warmth in her chest so complete that she had to press her hand against it, just the way Robert had pressed his fist against his sternum that cold morning long ago outside her road, when the feeling was too large to be comfortable. She called to him. He turned and looked at her, holding their son against his chest, the horse beside him in the golden afternoon light, and she called, "I love you, Robert McCrae," in a clear, carrying voice with no hesitation in it, and he said equally directly without any of the old careful containment, "I love you, Catherine McCrae," and Tom, between them, made a sound that was probably not a laugh but that they were always going to maintain was one. The year turned and the ranch grew. By 1881, the herd was at 22, and Robert had taken on a part-time hand, a young man named Charlie Webb from the Henderson Ranch's extra crew, who worked 3 days a week and was reliably capable. Catherine had extended the kitchen garden and was selling surplus vegetables at the Delwood Market, which had grown in the years of the town's expansion, and had begun to experiment with a small dairy operation using 2 additional cows, the butter from which she sold to the hotel that had opened on Delwood's Main Street in 1880. She kept meticulous records and paid off the last of the bank note in October of 1881, and she and Robert sat together at the kitchen table with the paid receipt between them, and she said, "Thomas would have been glad," and Robert said, "Yes, he would." And the moment was both sad and full of gladness, the way that the best kinds of memories are, neither pulling you backward nor cutting you off from the present. In the spring of 1882 she was pregnant again. This time she was perhaps more prepared for what it meant, practically and physically, and she organized her reduced work schedule with characteristic efficiency. Robert, who had learned from Tom's birth the specific shape of his own anxiety, managed it somewhat better the second time, though Martha Henderson, who came again, later reported to her husband that Robert had drunk 3 cups of coffee in 2 hours and then been quietly unwell in the yard, which seemed to her to perfectly illustrate the limits of masculine composure. Their second child was a girl, born in November of 1882, dark-haired and bright-eyed and loud, the way the very healthy ones are loud. They named her Alice Ruth McCrae, Alice for Robert's first wife, whose memory deserved a place in their life rather than a place only in the dark, and Ruth for Ruth Calloway, who had been present at both births with calm and expertise and a dry humor that Catherine deeply appreciated. Robert held Alice the morning after she was born, when Catherine was sleeping and the early light was just coming through the bedroom window, and he looked at this small person who carried the name of the woman he had lost and felt a thing he had not expected, a wholeness, not the erasure of what had been before, but the completion of something. A full circle that did not cancel anything but included everything. The grief and the years on the road and the dark night in the northeast corner, pressing cottonwood roots into the earth, and the woman with the dark brown eyes who had looked at his tree and left it standing, and all of it leading to this room, this morning, this child. He went out to the kitchen and made coffee and stood at the window watching the November day come up over the mountains, and then he went out to the northeast corner of the property and stood by the cottonwood tree, which was now tall enough to cast a real shadow, substantial and fully rooted, its bare winter branches reaching against the gray sky in the elegant, unself-conscious way of things that are exactly what they are. He stood there for a while in the cold morning, just a man and a tree, and felt the absolute specific rightness of his life. He walked back to the house and went in and put more wood on the fire and poured a second cup of coffee, and sat by the bedroom door listening to Catherine breathe in the steady rhythm of real sleep, and to Alice making small sleeping sounds in the cradle, and to Tom, who was 2 years old and already speaking in full sentences, beginning to stir in his small bed in the corner. He sat and listened to all of it, his whole life breathing and stirring in the rooms around him, and he was completely, undramatically, permanently at home. Tom was walking and talking and climbing every surface available to him by the spring of 1883, and Alice, at 5 months, was regarding the world with the same serious assessment that Tom had applied to Rosalie, and that she appeared to be applying to everything. The ranch was running well. Charlie Webb had become a full-time hand as the herd grew to 28, and Catherine had hired a part-time woman, a widow from Delwood named Grace Flowers, to help with the dairy operation on the 2 heaviest days of the week. Grace was quiet and competent and had 4 children of her own who were mostly grown, and she and Catherine developed the comfortable efficiency of 2 women who understand each other's priorities without needing to discuss them at length. William Henderson came by in March of 1883 with a proposition. His son James, who had been running the Henderson Spread's northern section, had decided to go to Denver, and William was at the age where he was beginning to think about consolidation rather than expansion. He proposed selling the northern section, which adjoined the McCrae Ranch's east fence and included a significant stretch of good grass country, at a price that reflected his friendship with the McCraes and his desire to see the land go to people who would work it well. He sat at the kitchen table and drank coffee and presented the numbers with the directness of an old man who has run out of patience for preamble. Robert and Catherine looked at each other across the table. The price was manageable given their current position. The land was genuinely good. The acquisition would bring them to 300 acres, which was a different kind of ranch, a ranch with real capacity, a ranch that could support a full crew and a substantial herd, and the kind of future that their children might reasonably want to grow into. "We will need until tomorrow to discuss it properly," Catherine said. "Take the time you need," William said comfortably. They discussed it that evening after the children were asleep, and the house was quiet, sitting at the kitchen table with the lamp between them and the figures on paper. The way they discussed everything of consequence, directly and practically, and with full honesty about both the risks and the possibility. Catherine said she thought the opportunity was real, and that the price was fair, and that the timing was right. Robert said he agreed on all counts and wanted to know what her reservation was, because he could hear one in her voice. She said the reservation was not a reservation but a feeling, the feeling of how large the aspiration had become compared to the beginning, when she had been a woman alone with 11 cattle and 160 acres, and a banknote she was barely meeting. Robert said that the aspiration had grown because the ranch had grown because they had built it, and building did not obligate you to stop. She said, "No, it does not." And they shook hands across the table, which made them both laugh, and signed the purchase agreement the following morning. The cottonwood tree, by the spring of 1883, was the dominant feature of the northeast corner. It was over 20 feet tall, its trunk a solid diameter that required 2 hands to span, its root system extending far enough that the sandy corner had been transformed over 5 years from the loosest and most troubled section of fence line to the most stable. The fence posts nearest the tree never moved. The soil around them was held and rooted and certain. Birds nested in it every spring, a different pair or two each year, and in the summer it cast a shade that the cattle sought out in the afternoon heat, standing in the cool dark of it with their eyes half closed and their tails moving. In the fall its leaves went gold and fell in carpets that Tom, at 3, chased with a glee that was entirely serious in the way that small children's glee is serious. And in the winter it stood bare and strong against the sky and was, in its winter form, perhaps most beautiful of all structure and patience and the bare fact of how deeply it was rooted. Catherine had told Tom the story of the tree when he was old enough to understand stories, which was earlier than most people expected, because he was a child who paid very close attention to the words of the adults around him and retained them with an accuracy that was occasionally uncomfortable. She had told him that his father had planted the tree before he and Catherine were married, that he had planted it in the dark without asking because he had a thing he wanted to say, and the tree was his way of saying it, and that she had found it and understood it and had not pulled it up, and that this was the beginning of their story. Tom had listened to this with his serious dark eyes and had then said, "So the tree is why we are here." And Catherine had said, "In a way, yes." Tom had considered this for a long moment and then said, "We should take very good care of it." And she had said, "We always will." Robert, when told of this conversation, had looked at his son with an expression that was partly pride and partly something too deep for naming, and had gone out to the northeast corner and stood under the tree for a while in the September afternoon. And when he came back in, he had gone to Catherine in the kitchen and simply held her for a moment, his chin on the top of her head and her face against his chest, without saying anything, which was, in the language they had built together over 5 years, a complete and sufficient sentence. The decade turned and the ranch grew and the children grew. Tom became the kind of boy who was always where the work was, first watching and then helping, and then doing with a concentrated capability that made Charlie Webb say more than once that the boy would be a fine rancher. Alice was smaller and quieter than her brother but had a will of iron about the things she cared about, which were books and horses, and as she grew older, the particular project of the kitchen garden, which she took over from her mother with such enthusiasm that Catherine, watching from the kitchen window, felt an echo of herself at that age, in Missouri, in a different garden, a different time. In 1885, Catherine's mother came to visit from Missouri, the first time they had seen each other in over a decade. She was older than Catherine had been prepared for, though she was still sharp and direct and possessed of the reading habit that Catherine had inherited. She stayed for 3 months and in that time made herself quietly essential, holding Alice while Catherine worked, reading to Tom in the evenings, occupying the bunkhouse, which Robert had properly fitted out as a guest room after Charlie Webb had moved into a small house on the expanded property. She watched Robert and Catherine in the way that mothers watch their grown children's spouses, carefully and with full attention to the truths that display themselves in small moments. And at the end of her visit, she took Catherine's hands in the yard before climbing into the wagon that would take her to Delwood and the stage east, and she said, "You did the right thing, staying. And you found the right man." And Catherine said, "I know, Mama." And they held each other for a long time, two stubborn, capable women who had each found their ground and held it. And the morning light was very bright on the mountains. In 1886, Catherine was 38 and Robert was 39, and the ranch was a good and running thing, and their children were healthy, and the cottonwood tree in the northeast corner was now a landmark, tall enough to be visible from the road, identifiable from a distance. The tree on the McCrae place that grew on the corner where the fence was always the steadiest, and the cattle were always glad to stand. Travelers on the road sometimes stopped to look at it, not knowing what it was or what it meant, just sensing the weight of a thing that has grown where it was deliberately planted and been tended with love, which is a quality that communicates itself even to strangers. Robert and Catherine were sitting on the porch one evening in late summer after supper, in the way they had sat on the porch for years, the children inside, the night coming down over the mountains. Tom was 12 and Alice was 6, and the house behind them was full of the sounds of homework being resisted and Charlie Webb's guitar, which he had taken to playing on summer evenings from his house at the edge of the property, audible at a comfortable distance. Catherine had her hand in Robert's and they were not talking, just sitting, watching the first stars appear in the deep blue sky. "Robert," she said. "Yes," he said. "Tell me something." "What kind of something?" She tilted her head against his shoulder. "Something you have not told me yet." He was quiet for a moment in the considering way. "The night I planted the tree," he said, "I was scared." "Scared of what?" "That you would pull it up," he said. "That I would come back in the morning and the corner would be empty and I would understand from that that I had misread everything and should ride on." He paused. "I was very afraid of that." She turned to look at him in the dusk, at his profile that she knew as well as her own, the lines deeper now at 40, the gray more generous at his temples, the particular quality of stillness and honesty that had been the first thing she had recognized in him. "But you planted it anyway," she said. "Yes," he said. "I thought, if I do nothing the answer is already no. At least if I plant the tree, there is a chance." She looked at him for a long time. She thought about the woman she had been in that April morning, hard with grief and pride and the determined solitariness of a person who has had everything taken and rebuilt herself around the taking. She thought about standing with her hand on the bark and feeling the resistance of the roots and letting go. She thought about walking away and glancing back twice and feeling that thing she could not name. "I almost pulled it up," she said. He turned to look at her. "I had my hand on it," she said. "I held it for a moment and I felt that it was rooted, that whoever had planted it had taken real care with the planting. And I thought, I will pull it up later, I will deal with this later, but later never came." She paused. "I think I knew even then that I was not going to pull it up. I think some part of me understood what it was before I had words for it." His hand tightened on hers. "Why?" he said. Even then, knowing nothing about who had planted it, she considered this. The night was full now, the stars thick above the mountains, and Charlie Webb's guitar was playing something slow and sweet. "Because it was planted with care," she said. "And I had not had someone plant anything for me in a long time. And care, it turns out, is very difficult to pull up once it has taken root in you." He brought her hand up and pressed his mouth to her knuckles, the old gesture, the one he had found somewhere in the years of their marriage and returned to when words were full but quiet. She felt the warmth of it along her whole arm. "You are the finest thing that has ever happened to me, Catherine McCrae," he said against her hand. "You are the finest thing that has ever happened to me," she said back, fully and without caveat. They sat on the porch until the night was full, and the stars were brilliant, and the guitar had gone quiet, and then they went inside to their children, and their house, and their life, which was exactly the life they had built from a tree in a fence corner, and two people stubborn enough to stay. The cottonwood grew on through the years. It grew through the droughts of the late '80s that tried everyone in the basin country, but could not touch a tree whose roots went down to the creek's water table. It grew through the hard winter of 1887 when the snow came to the eaves, and even the creek froze for 3 weeks, and the cottonwood stood in the freeze with its bare branches silver with ice, beautiful and enduring. It grew through Tom's adolescence, and the summer he decided he wanted to be a cowboy in the old sense, working drives, and Robert let him go for 1 summer and 1 summer only, knowing that the experience would bring him home with a clear understanding of what he had here, which it did. Tom returning in the fall with trail dust, and a new respect for the ranch that had seemed ordinary until he had seen the alternative. It grew through Alice's voracious reading and her discovery of the new schoolteacher in Delwood, a young woman named Rose McCrae, who arrived in 1889 and transformed the school and became Alice's particular heroine, and through Alice's subsequent fierce declaration that she intended to be a teacher herself, which neither Catherine nor Robert discouraged, because they had not raised their children to have small ambitions. The ranch reached 35 cattle in 1889, which was the number Robert had set as the long-term target in his first careful planning, and which they achieved on schedule. Charlie Webb, who had become as much a part of the place as the fence posts, was now the foreman in everything but name and ran the operation with a steady hand. Catherine's dairy and garden sales were a consistent supplement to the cattle income, and the last of their debts had been paid years ago, the land free and clear in a way that Thomas Norris had dreamed of and that Catherine and Robert had made real together. In the spring of 1890, they planted a second cottonwood. They did it together, on a Sunday, with both children helping, Tom at 20 doing the heavy digging and Alice at 8 directing the proceedings with her usual authority. They planted it in the southeast corner, where the creek came closest to the property boundary and the land was richest, and they planted it deliberately and in daylight with full ceremony, each of them pressing the earth around the roots in turn, and Robert pouring the first water from the bucket he had carried from the creek. Tom looked at his parents over the planted tree and said, with the directness that was entirely his mother's, "This one is the first tree's answer." And Catherine looked at Robert and Robert looked at Catherine, and what passed between them in that look was so complete and so full of everything that had been and would be that neither of them could speak for a moment. "Yes," Robert said finally, "that is exactly right." The spring that year was generous. The grass came in deep and green, the cattle were fat, the new tree was putting on its first growth with the same determined ambition as the first one had done 12 years before in the sandy soil of the northeast corner. Catherine stood one morning in May at the edge of the yard and looked across her land, their land, 300 acres of Colorado Basin country under a sky that went on forever, and she felt the fullness of it in every part of her. Robert came up beside her and stood looking at the same view. His hand found hers in the easy, unthinking way of long habit. "What are you thinking?" He said, "I am thinking about that April morning," she said, "when I found your tree." "What about it?" "I am thinking that I did not know then what I was not pulling up," she said. "I did not know that I was not pulling up all of this. All of it, Robert. The children and the cattle and the land and the years and the mornings and the evenings and everything we have been to each other." She turned to look at him. "I thought I was just leaving a tree." He looked at her and his face was everything she had ever loved in him, the honesty and the patience and the depth of feeling that had always been there, running under everything like the creek ran under the ice in winter, present and moving even when you could not see it. "It was not just a tree," he said. "No," she said. "It never was." He kissed her temple and she leaned into him, and they stood looking out at their land in the clear Colorado morning. The mountains sharp and blue above the basin, the grass moving in the wind, the first cottonwood standing tall and rooted in its corner after 12 years of determined growing, and the second one small and new in its corner, just beginning. Everything they had made was here. Everything they were was here. The roots went down and down and down into the good earth of the place they had chosen and been chosen by, and there was no part of it that was not firmly, permanently, joyfully held. Tom married a sensible and warm-hearted young woman named Clara in the summer of 1898, a rancher's daughter from the next county who had been introduced through the Hendersons, and they settled on the northern section of the McCrae land that had once been the Henderson northern section, building their own house there with the help of the whole family. Their first child, a boy, was born in 1899 and was named Robert James, for his grandfather and for James Henderson, in the continuing tradition of naming that the McCraes had always used to hold the past in the present with honor. Alice became a teacher. She taught in Delwood for 7 years, and then married a doctor named Henry Aldrich in 1902, and moved to Pueblo, taking with her the reading habit and the fierce capability and the particular directness that were entirely her mother's, and writing long, detailed letters home that Robert and Catherine read aloud to each other on winter evenings with pleasure and pride. Catherine and Robert grew older on the land they had made, and the making of it had threaded through them so completely that it was impossible to separate the people from the place, the way a tree's roots become inseparable from the soil after enough years. They did not speak about their age with any particular drama, because they had both always been practical people, but they felt it in the way that outdoor people feel the seasons, as a natural fact that required acknowledgement and adjustment rather than resistance. Robert's hair went fully gray in his early 60s and suited him, Catherine told him, which was her honest opinion. Catherine's dark hair went silver at the temples and then fully silver, and she wore it with the same straightforward manner she brought to everything, not attempting to diminish or disguise what she was, because what she was had always been sufficient and had only become more itself with time. They sat on the porch on summer evenings as they always had. The view from the porch had not changed in its essential character in 25 years, though every specific detail of it had improved, the barn better and the paddock stronger and the land more fully realized in its potential. The cottonwood in the northeast corner was now enormous, a genuine landmark tree, visible from the road and from the ridge and from the Henderson place beyond the eastern fence. Travelers still stopped to look at it. Tom's children climbed in it when they came to visit, which was often, the branches being perfectly spaced for small determined climbers, and the trunk being wide enough to lean against for the reading of books, which the second young Robert did with a focus that made his grandmother smile the specific smile of recognition. On the evening of their 30th wedding anniversary, in February of 1909, Catherine and Robert sat by the fire with coffee and the particular companionable silence of two people who have been together long enough that the silence is its own language. Outside, the February cold was sharp and the stars were brilliant. Inside, the fire was steady and the house was warm, the same house, built and rebuilt and improved and added to over 30 years until it was a full and comfortable place, but the same house on the same 160 original acres with the 200 acres beyond, and the cottonwood tree in the northeast corner standing in the winter dark with its bare branches reaching. 30 years, Catherine said. Yes, Robert said. Do you regret any of it? He looked at her. The firelight was kind and his eyes were the same steady gray they had always been. Not a single morning, he said. She reached across and took his hand. Neither do I, she said. Not even the hard ones. Especially not the hard ones, he said. The hard ones are how you know it was real. She thought about that. She thought about the chain on the road and the dam in the creek and the 14 months alone before he came, and the April morning with her hand on the bark of a small tree that someone had planted with care on her land in the dark. She thought about all the mornings and evenings and seasons since, all the work and the love and the specific life that had grown up around and between them like a tree growing toward light. "Robert," she said, "yes. Thank you for planting that tree." He was quiet for a moment. The fire shifted and settled. "Thank you for not pulling it up," he said. She laughed, the laugh that still came quickly and genuinely when he said the right thing. And he smiled, and the fire burned warm. And outside in the northeast corner of the ranch where the fence was always the steadiest, and the soil was the best held, and the birds came back every spring to nest in the wide-reaching branches. The cottonwood tree stood in the winter night as it had stood for 31 years, rooted and reaching and certain, a thing planted with love and left to grow.